Aurora, Illinois. The city lights are still blazing. Skyscrapers stretch proudly into the night. But you know what? Right beneath those glittering symbols of success lies a completely different world. A world that, it seems, many of us deliberately choose to ignore. It's a place where cold, damp alleyways become makeshift homes, where a sigh blends into the sound of the wind whistling through every crack. Tonight, we're going to step together into that world, a place where the darkness doesn't just conceal secrets, but sometimes it silently shelters unsung heroes, the most unexpected heroes, in a hidden corner of Aurora. There's a man. People call him Isaiah Washington, or more familiarly, Ice. He's in his late 50s. His face is deeply etched with the lines of time and hardship. His appearance might be rugged, but hidden in his eyes is an unusual sharpness, a gaze that not everyone possesses. He's like a ghost, drifting silently through the bustling current of life. Invisible, hardly noticed. Isaiah's past is a mystery, a closed book that no one has yet had the chance to open. And then, in that seemingly forgotten world, there are those who wear the uniform of justice, but whose actions are a complete betrayal of it. Officer Miller, big, white, his eyes always condescending. He likes to assert his power with his fists, with intimidation riding with him, is Officer Kowalski, thinner, but no less cruel, a yes man, ready to go along with all of Miller's dirty games. One night, perhaps because their patrol was too boring, or simply because they wanted some sick amusement, Miller and Kowalski decided they would teach the vermin a lesson. They stumbled upon Isaiah, scavenging for scraps of food, behind a fancy restaurant that had just closed. The scene that followed is hard to fully describe in words. Shouts, the brutal thud of boots. Isaiah was shoved, his back slammed hard against the cold metal of a dumpster. Leftover food scattered, sticking to his worn-out coat. And then, the savage laughter of the two officers echoed, tearing through the quiet night. Strangely, Isaiah didn't fight back, not a single plea. He just silently endured. But his eyes, those sharp eyes, were silently recording, remembering every face, every action, every word. They didn't know. Those men gloating over their sick fun had no idea. That kick wasn't just aimed at a poor homeless man. That kick had unknowingly awakened something that had been dormant for a very long time. A hidden strength from a heroic past that they could never have imagined. Have you ever thought that behind a facade of weakness, of resignation, could be a smoldering fire waiting to ignite? The story of Isaiah Washington will show us that sometimes true heroes don't wear capes, they hide right in the darkest corners of life. And tonight, that darkness is about to speak. Isaiah was no ordinary homeless man, not by a long shot. His past, a carefully guarded secret, began to seep into the present, like a persistent fog clinging to the pre-dawn light. You see, this man, this Ice, was once Sergeant Isaiah Washington, a Green Beret, a name whispered with respect in certain shadowed circles. A man who had danced with death in far-flung deserts and dense jungles, emerging operateur, a master of reconnaissance and survival. His medals, if he still kept them, would tell tales of quiet bravery, of missions chung gong, of lives saved, all far from the indifferent glare of city lights. The cold, unforgiving streets of Aurora, Illinois, now became his new battleground. The enemy wasn't an insurgent force in a distant land. No, the enemy wore a badge, a symbol that was supposed to represent justice, not tyranny. The city is just another kind of jungle, Isaiah might have thought, his eyes scanning the alleys. Different predators, same fight for survival. He began to watch them. Miller, Kowalski, silently, methodically. His old training kicked in as if it had never left. He learned their patrol routes, their usual haunts, The greasy diner where they took their extended coffee breaks, the dimly lit bars where their laughter was a little too loud, their boasts a little too brazen, and more importantly, he noted their clandestine meetings, the quick, hushed conversations with certain unsavory characters like Sal, the Weasel Moretti. Sal ran a pawn shop downtown, a grimy establishment that was more than just a place for desperate people to hawk their meager possessions. It was a known hub for fences, a place where stolen goods found new homes, and where, rumor had it, certain services could be procured. For a price. Isaiah saw Officer Miller on more than one occasion slip into the back room of Sal's shop, emerging minutes later with a slightly thicker wallet and a smug grin. He saw Kowalski acting as a lookout, his shifty eyes darting around, a poor imitation of a seasoned sentinel. Isaiah moved like a wraith through the urban landscape. Years of navigating treacherous terrain had honed his senses. He used the shadows as his cloak, the ambient city noise as his cover. He could blend into a crowd or disappear into a doorway, unnoticed, unseen. Every grimy alleyway was a potential observation post, every discarded newspaper a temporary blind. He memorized faces, license plate numbers, snippets of overheard conversations. That cheap, battered cell phone, the one he'd bought with carefully hoarded spare change, became his most valuable tool. He'd position himself, sometimes for hours, in the biting cold or stifling heat, just to catch a few crucial words. A clandestine exchange. He'd record their voices, Miller's booming, arrogant tone, Kowalski's nervous, reedy agreement, Sal's oily, conspiratorial whisper. The phone's memory filled with damning evidence, a digital tapestry of their corruption. It's all about patterns, Isaiah would tell himself, a mantra from his old life. Everyone has a pattern. You find the pattern, you find the weakness. And Miller and Kowalski, for all their street smarts and bluster, were creatures of habit, predictable in their cruelty, predictable in their greed. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea. They were being stalked by a master. One evening, Isaiah was huddled near a steam vent, trying to absorb some of its meager warmth, when he saw Miller and Sal meet in a deserted parking garage. The acoustics were surprisingly good. He held his phone as steady as his shivering hands would allow. "The shipment's coming in Tuesday, Miller." Sal's voice, tinny but clear on the recording. "Same spot. You make sure your boys in blue are looking the other way, yeah?" Miller chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Looking the other way costs extra this time, Sal. Inflation, you know." Yeah, I know all about your damn inflation," Sal grumbled. "Just be there, and no screw-ups. This one's big." Isaiah saved the recording, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. Each piece of evidence was a small victory, a step closer to an unknown end. He wasn't sure yet what he would do with it all. The idea of going to the authorities, to other cops, seemed laughable. Who would believe a homeless man over two of their own? Especially a black homeless man. The system, he knew, was designed to protect its own, but he also knew, from a lifetime of impossible missions, that sometimes you had to create your own path to justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had served his country with honor, who had risked his life countless times for the freedoms these men so casually abused, was now an outcast, a shadow forced to use the skills he'd learned to protect to now expose. The streets of Aurora were a far cry from the mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of South America, but the principles remained the same. Observe, adapt, survive, and when the time is right, strike. He learned about their personal lives too, in small, fragmented ways. He saw Miller's expensive car, far too flashy for a cop's salary. He overheard Kowalski on the phone, arguing with someone, presumably his wife, about money. These details, seemingly insignificant, painted a fuller picture of the men he was up against. Men driven by greed, men with vulnerabilities. This quiet, methodical intelligence gathering was a dangerous game. There were close calls. One night, while observing a late-night exchange between Kowalski and a known drug dealer behind a closed liquor store, a stray dog started barking, drawing Kowalski's attention. Isaiah froze, melting into the deeper shadows of a recessed doorway, his heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm against his ribs. Kowalski peered into the darkness, his hand instinctively going to his holstered weapon. "Stupid mutt," he cursed before turning back to his illicit business. Isaiah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was out of practice, perhaps, but the instincts, they were still sharp. Sharper than these street thugs in uniform could ever comprehend. He wasn't just collecting evidence against Miller and Kowalski. He was relearning who he was. The years on the street had tried to strip him of his identity, to reduce him to just another faceless, nameless statistic. But this new, self-imposed mission, it reawakened something within him. The discipline, the focus, the unwavering sense of purpose that had defined Sergeant Isaiah Ice Washington. He was no longer just surviving. He was fighting, in his own way, in the only way he knew how. The city was a labyrinth, and he was navigating its darkest corridors, a silent hunter on the trail of a very specific, very dangerous prey. And the beauty of it? His prey had absolutely no idea they were being hunted at all. They saw a broken old man. They couldn't see the Green Beret, not yet, but they would. Oh, they most certainly would. Into this den of casual cruelty and ingrained corruption walked Officer David Ramirez. Young, idealistic. Just a few months out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, his badge gleaming with a pride that hadn't yet been tarnished. He was Latino from a hard-working family in a neighboring town, and he'd joined the Aurora PD with a genuine desire to serve, to protect, to make a difference in a world that often felt like it was teetering on the edge. He'd requested Aurora specifically, hoping to be part of a diverse, dynamic force. What he found, however, in certain corners of the precinct was a far cry from the noble image he'd held in his mind. He found Miller, he found Kowalski, and he found a culture that sometimes seemed to reward brutality and turn a blind eye to misconduct. Ramirez was quickly assigned to patrol with more seasoned officers, and fate, or perhaps just the cruel rotation of a precinct scheduler, often paired him with Miller and Kowalski. At first, he tried to rationalize what he saw. Maybe Miller was just having a bad day. Maybe Kowalski was just trying to fit in. Maybe the homeless man they'd shoved around really was being belligerent, though Ramirez hadn't seen it that way. But the bad days became every day. The fitting in looked a lot like gleeful participation, and the belligerent homeless people often just looked scared and hungry. He saw it with Isaiah, the quiet, older black man who seemed to be a particular target for Miller's ire. Ramirez watched, his stomach churning, as Miller would swagger up to Isaiah, a sneer plastered on his face. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Still breathing our good city air, are we, Grandpa?" Miller would taunt, his voice dripping with contempt. Kowalski would snicker beside him, a loyal hyena. Ramirez would stand a little ways off, pretending to check his radio or scan the street, anything to avoid making eye contact, anything to avoid acknowledging the shame that was coiling in his gut. One afternoon, they rolled up on a small encampment of homeless individuals under a bridge. Miller, in a particularly foul mood after a dressing down from the lieutenant about paperwork, decided to take it out on them. "All right, you bums, party's over," he bellowed, kicking over a makeshift shelter made of cardboard and a tattered tarp. "This ain't no five-star hotel. Pack your crap and get lost." An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of hardship, tried to gather her few belongings, a faded photograph slipping from her trembling hands. Kowalski stepped on it, grinding it into the dirt with the heel of his boot. "Oops," he said, not sounding sorry at all. Ramirez felt a surge of anger, so strong it almost choked him. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but then he caught Miller's eye, a cold warning glare, a look that said, "Stay out of it, rookie, or you'll regret it." And Ramirez, young, outnumbered, and acutely aware of the unspoken rules of this particular boys' club, fell silent. The words died on his lips, leaving a bitter taste. That night he called his mother. Maria Ramirez was a strong woman, a devout Catholic who had raised David and his sister on her own after their father, a good cop in their old neighborhood, had died young from a heart attack. She'd always told David, "Mijo, To wear that badge is a privilege, a sacred trust. You protect the weak. You speak for those who have no voice. That is what your father believed. Mama, David began, his voice strained. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. What is it, David? What's wrong? Maria's voice, usually so warm, was laced with concern. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the specifics. How could he describe the casual cruelty, the open disdain he witnessed daily? How could he admit his own cowardice in the face of it? It's not what I thought it would be, Mama. Some of these guys, they're not like Papa was. No, mijo, Maria said softly. Not all men are like your father, but you are. You have his heart. You have his integrity. Don't let anyone take that from you. Sometimes, David, the hardest thing in the world is to do the right thing when everyone around you is doing wrong. But that is when it matters most. Her words stayed with him, a small flickering candle of hope in the growing darkness of his disillusionment. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to be the man his father was, the man his mother believed him to be. But the reality of the precinct, the pressure to conform, the fear of reprisal, it was a heavy weight. Isaiah, from his vantage point in the shadows, noticed Ramirez. He saw the discomfort in the young officer's eyes, the way he'd look away when Miller and Kowalski were at their worst. He saw the subtle hesitation before Ramirez would reluctantly follow their lead. Isaiah had seen men like Ramirez before, in the military. Young recruits caught between their conscience and the pressures of a flawed system. Some broke, some bent. A precious few found the strength to stand firm. Isaiah wondered which path Ramirez would choose. He filed the young officer's face away in his mental database, another piece of the complex puzzle he was assembling. He wasn't an enemy, not yet anyway. He was a variable, a potential unknown in a very dangerous equation. Ramirez, for his part, started noticing Isaiah too, not just as another homeless man, but as an individual. He saw the intelligence in Isaiah's eyes, the quiet dignity that even Miller's abuse couldn't fully extinguish. He saw Isaiah share a meager piece of bread with another, even more destitute soul. He saw Isaiah gently tend to a stray cat with an injured paw. These small acts of kindness, performed in the shadows, stood in stark contrast to the ugliness he witnessed in the harsh glare of his patrol car's headlights. One particularly cold evening, Ramirez was on solo foot patrol downtown, a rare occurrence. He saw Isaiah huddled in a doorway, shivering despite his layers of tattered clothing. On an impulse, Ramirez ducked into a nearby 24-hour convenience store and bought a hot coffee and a prepackaged sandwich. He walked back to the doorway. "Officer," Isaiah said, his voice low, his eyes wary, expecting the usual harassment. Ramirez held out the coffee and sandwich. It's pretty cold out tonight, sir," he stammered, feeling awkward, almost ashamed. "Thought you might appreciate this." Isaiah looked at the offering, then up at Ramirez's face, his gaze searching. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Isaiah reached out and took the coffee. "Thank you, officer," he said, his voice a little less guarded. "Ramirez," David supplied. "My name is David Ramirez." Isaiah nodded. Isaiah. It was a small gesture, a cup of coffee, a sandwich. But in that moment, a fragile, unspoken connection was made. A flicker of humanity in a landscape often devoid of it. Ramirez walked away, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. He'd done something small, something good. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Isaiah, sipping the hot coffee, watched the young officer disappear around the corner. Ramirez was different. He was a light, however dim, in the suffocating darkness of Miller and Kowalski's world. The question was, would that light be strong enough to survive? Or would it too be snuffed out? The rain came down in sheets that night, a relentless, drenching torrent that turned Aurora's streets into slick, black mirrors reflecting the bleary neon signs. It was the kind of night that gnawed at your bones, the kind of night where even the rats sought deeper shelter. For Isaiah, it was just another layer of misery piled onto an already heavy burden. He'd found a relatively dry alcove beneath an overpass, the roar of traffic overhead a deafening constant companion. But even here the wind whipped the rain inward, soaking his thin blanket, chilling him to the core. It was on this wretched night that Miller and Kowalski found him. They were in a particularly foul temper. Earlier, a high-profile drug bust they'd been angling to be part of, hoping for a commendation, had gone sideways. Another unit had gotten the collar, and Miller felt slighted, his ego bruised. He needed an outlet, a way to vent his frustration, and who better than their favorite punching bag? "Well, looky here, Kowalski," Miller slurred, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. They'd clearly made a stop after their shift. "It's our old pal Ice trying to stay dry. Ain't that cute?" Kowalski, never one to be outdone in sycophancy, chimed in. "Yeah, boss, looks like a drowned rat, a black drowned rat." The racial slur, spat out with such casual venom, hung in the damp air. Isaiah didn't rise to the bait. He just pulled his tattered blanket tighter, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond them. This only seemed to enrage Miller further. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue? Or did the rain wash away your witty comebacks?" Miller advanced, his large frame blocking what little shelter Isaiah had. "We're just trying to keep the peace, officer," Isaiah said, his voice raspy but steady. "Keep the peace?" Miller scoffed. "You are the disturbance, old man. You and your kind. A blight on this city." What happened next was a brutal, senseless explosion of violence. Miller, fueled by alcohol and a deep-seated malice, began to kick Isaiah, hard, in the ribs, in the stomach. Kowalski joined in, landing blows with his nightstick. Isaiah curled into a ball, trying to protect his head, his vital organs, the years of training and absorbing and deflecting pain kicking in. But there was only so much one man, cold, hungry, and outnumbered, could take. Each impact sent a fresh wave of agony through him. He could hear their grunts, their jeering laughter, even over the roar of the rain and traffic. "This is for messing up my night, you piece of trash," Miller roared, delivering a final vicious kick to Isaiah's side. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. They left him there, crumpled and bleeding in the cold, wet darkness, their laughter fading as they stumbled off into the storm. Isaiah lay there for a long time, pain radiating through every inch of his body. He tasted blood. Breathing was a struggle. He suspected a few ribs were cracked, maybe worse. For a moment, a wave of utter despair washed over him. What was the point? Why endure this? Why fight? But then something shifted. A deep, primal anger, an anger he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years, began to smolder within him, fanned by the injustice, by the sheer, unadulterated hate he had just experienced. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every forgotten soul, every person deemed less than by those in power. This had to stop. With a monumental effort, groaning with pain, Isaiah pushed himself up. Every movement was an agony. He leaned against the cold, damp concrete wall, taking ragged, shallow breaths. He had to get help. Not for his injuries, though they were severe. He had to get help to bring these bastards down. He thought of the recordings on his cheap phone, tucked safely inside his innermost pocket, wrapped in a plastic bag. He thought of the patterns he'd observed, the network of corruption he was slowly uncovering. But who would listen? Who would believe him? Then a name surfaced from the depths of his memory. A name he hadn't spoken, hadn't even thought of in nearly 2 decades. General Marcus Thorne. The Rock. A man of immense power, of unimpeachable integrity. A man whose life Isaiah had saved, under heavy fire in a dusty, God-forsaken corner of Basra, Iraq during the early days of the war. It had been a desperate, bloody firefight. Then Captain Thorne had been pinned down, his unit decimated, his situation hopeless. Isaiah, then a young sergeant, had defied orders, leading a daring, almost suicidal maneuver to extract Thorne, carrying him through a hail of bullets to safety. Thorne had never forgotten. He'd tried to keep in touch after Isaiah left the service, but Isaiah, already wrestling with his own demons, had faded away, become a ghost. Could Thorne even still be in a position to help? Was he even still alive? It was a long shot, a desperate last-ditch gamble, But it was the only card Isaiah had left to play. He stumbled out from under the overpass into the driving rain, his body screaming in protest. He knew there was an old, rarely used public phone booth a few blocks away near the derelict train station. It was a relic from a bygone era, but he'd seen it still had a dial tone a few weeks back. Each step was a fresh torment. The city lights blurred through the rain and his pain-filled vision. He focused on that phone booth, a distant, almost mythical beacon. When he finally reached it, he was gasping for breath, his clothes plastered to his skin, blood and rainwater mingling on his face. His fingers, numb with cold and trembling from the beating, fumbled in his pocket for a precious hoarded quarter. He dropped it twice before finally managing to slot it into the coin receptacle. Then, with a surge of adrenaline, he punched in a long memorized sequence of numbers, General Thorne's private unlisted number, a number Thorne himself had pressed into Isaiah's hand all those years ago, saying, "If you ever need anything, Sergeant, anything at all." The line crackled. It rang once, twice. Isaiah's heart hammered against his, possibly broken ribs. He was about to hang up, to give in to the encroaching blackness that threatened to engulf him, when a voice answered. A deep, authoritative voice, roughened by age but still undeniably powerful. "Thorne." Just one word. Isaiah licked his cracked, bleeding lips. His own voice was a barely audible rasp. "General Thorne?" A pause. "Who is this?" The voice was cautious, professional. It's Sergeant Washington, sir," Isaiah managed, leaning heavily against the cold glass of the phone booth. "Isaiah Washington, from Basra." Silence on the other end. A long, charged silence. Isaiah could hear the rain drumming on the roof of the booth, could feel the cold seeping deeper into his bones. Had he made a mistake? Had Thorne forgotten? Then the voice came again, softer now, tinged with disbelief, with something akin to shock. "Ice? Sergeant Ice Washington? My God, is that really you?" Relief, so potent it almost buckled Isaiah's knees, flooded through him. "Yes, sir. It's me." "Ice, I thought you were—" Thorne's voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Where are you? What's happened to you?" "General," Isaiah said, cutting through the pleasantries, his voice gaining a desperate urgency. "I'm in trouble, sir. Bad trouble. And I need to call in that favor. That old debt." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. None at all. General Marcus Thorne, a man who commanded armies, a man who advised presidents, spoke with a quiet, steely resolve that cut through Isaiah's pain and fear. "Tell me everything, Sergeant, and consider that debt repaid. Whatever you need, Ice, whatever it takes." Leaning there in that grimy, rain-lashed phone booth, a broken man on the brink of collapse, Isaiah Washington finally allowed a sliver of hope to pierce through the suffocating darkness. The ghost was about to get some very powerful backup. The game had just changed, dramatically. General Marcus Thorne was not a man who made idle promises. The words, "whatever it takes," were for him a solemn vow, a commitment etched in the bedrock of his character. The moment he hung up with Isaiah, after getting a fragmented, pain-laced account of the situation in Aurora, and a location where Isaiah could be found, the Rock moved with the swift, decisive efficiency that had defined his long and distinguished military career. This wasn't just about repaying an old debt. This was about one of his own, a soldier who had been grievously wronged, a soldier who had, by the sounds of it, stumbled into something rotten in the civilian world. Within hours, a discreet blacked-out SUV, the kind that screams government business without saying a word, was dispatched to the coordinates Isaiah had given. A derelict warehouse on the outskirts of Aurora, where he sometimes found shelter. Inside were two individuals who operated in the shadows, a far cry from the uniformed thugs Isaiah had been dealing with. The first was Colonel Evelyn Hayes. Sharp, incisive, mid-40s, with a mind like a steel trap and eyes that missed nothing. She was one of Thorne's most trusted intelligence officers, a woman who could untangle the most complex knots of deception. Accompanying her was Special Agent John Riley of the FBI. Older, grizzled, a veteran of countless high-stakes investigations, Riley had a reputation for being relentless, a bulldog who, once he sank his teeth into a case, never let go. Thorne had pulled strings, called in markers, and leveraged connections that reached into the highest echelons of federal law enforcement to get Riley assigned. This was no longer a local matter. Colonel Hayes and Agent Riley found Isaiah in a pitiful state, battered, shivering, but his eyes, despite the pain, still held that defiant, intelligent spark. They didn't waste time with platitudes. A military medic, also part of their discreet team, immediately tended to Isaiah's injuries. Multiple cracked ribs, a concussion, severe bruising. While the medic worked, Hayes and Riley listened, their expressions unreadable as Isaiah. His voice raspy, recounted his observations, the recordings on his phone, the names: Miller, Kowalski, Sal Moretti, and the overseeing presence of Captain Frank Donovan. The precinct commander Isaiah suspected was the linchpin of the local corruption. "This Captain Donovan," Riley interjected, his voice a low rumble. "You're sure he's involved?" Isaiah nodded, wincing as the medic taped his ribs. "Miller and Kowalski operate with too much impunity, Agent. Someone higher up is giving them cover. Donovan fits. He's always at the precinct late, takes closed-door meetings with Miller. And his lifestyle, it doesn't match a captain's pay grade." Colonel Hayes was already on a secure satellite phone, relaying information back to a hand-picked team at a temporary, covert command post they were establishing in a nondescript office building just outside Aurora. "Run full background and financial deep dives on officers Michael Miller, Samuel Kowalski, and Captain Frank Donovan, Aurora PD. Cross-reference with known associate Salvatore Moretti, owner of Sal's Pawn, and get me everything you can find on a Sergeant Isaiah Ice Washington, U.S. Army Special Forces, Green Berets, honorably discharged approximately 15 years ago." The information that flowed back was, to put it mildly, astounding, especially regarding Isaiah. His service record was heavily redacted, even for someone with Hayes's clearance, hinting at operations so sensitive they were buried deep within the military's most secret archives. What wasn't redacted spoke volumes: Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, multiple Purple Hearts. He was, as Hayes later reported to Thorne, a goddamn national hero who fell through the cracks. Thorne's response was curt and unwavering. "Then it's our duty to pick him up and dust him off, and bring hell down on those who put him there." The unofficial Joint Task Force, a blend of military intelligence assets and FBI investigators, began to move with quiet precision. Surveillance teams, a mix of plainclothes operatives and sophisticated technical equipment, were deployed. Miller's flashy car, Kowalski's nervous late-night jaunts, Donovan's discreet meetings, all were now under the microscope. Financial analysts began to peel back the layers of their bank accounts, shell corporations, and unexplained cash deposits. The recordings Isaiah had painstakingly collected on his cheap phone, once cleaned up by forensic audio technicians, provided invaluable direct evidence. "This Sal Moretti character," Riley mused, looking at a surveillance photo of Sal meeting Miller behind the pawn shop. "He's the weak link, a low-level opportunist. He'll sing like a canary if we squeeze him right." Their investigation quickly confirmed Isaiah's suspicions, and then some. The corruption wasn't just a few bad cops shaking down local businesses. It was a more organized enterprise. Donovan was indeed the orchestrator, using Miller and Kowalski as his primary enforcers. They were running protection rackets, taking kickbacks from drug dealers, and even, it appeared, facilitating the movement of stolen goods through Sal Moretti's network. But the rabbit hole went deeper. Financial trails started leading towards a prominent local politician, City Councilman Arthur Peterson, a man with a squeaky clean public image and a penchant for lucrative real estate deals. Peterson, it seemed, was using Donovan's crew to encourage residents in certain low-income neighborhoods populated largely by minorities and the disenfranchised, including many of Aurora's homeless, to sell their properties cheap, clearing the way for his urban renewal projects, which were, in reality, high-profit luxury developments. "So it's not just about greed," Colonel Hayes observed. looking at a map pinpointing Peterson's targeted areas. It's about systemic displacement preying on the vulnerable. Isaiah wasn't just a random target for their abuse. He was living in the way of their profits. Isaiah, now recovering in a secure, undisclosed location provided by Thorne's team, found himself being debriefed extensively. It was strange, after so many years of silence, of being invisible, to suddenly be the center of such intense focus. But he answered their questions patiently, his memory for detail proving to be astonishingly accurate. He provided context, nuance, the kind of on-the-ground intelligence that no satellite or wiretap could ever fully capture. He knew the rhythms of the street, the whispers in the shadows. Councilman Peterson, Isaiah said during one session with Riley and Hayes. He gives a big charity speech every Thanksgiving down at the community center, hands out turkeys. Miller and Donovan are always there, providing security, looking like heroes. It's a performance. Behind the scenes, they're pushing people like me out, making sure the areas he wants are unappealing to legitimate buyers until he swoops in. Riley made a note. The public face and the private machinations, classic. The net was tightening. Every piece of information Isaiah provided was a thread, and Hayes and Riley were experts at weaving those threads into an inescapable web. They were building a federal case, something far beyond the scope of what local internal affairs, even if they weren't compromised, could handle. The operation was still completely off the books, known only to a handful of trusted individuals. Thorne wanted it that way. He didn't want any leaks, any political interference until they had an airtight case. The krakens of the deep state, once awakened, were now methodically, silently closing in on their unsuspecting prey in Aurora. Miller, Kowalski, Donovan, and even Councilman Peterson were blissfully unaware that their dirty little empire was about to come crashing down, all because they had picked on the wrong homeless man. They had awakened a ghost, and that ghost had friends in very, very high places. While the covert task force meticulously built its case against the corrupt core of the Aurora PD, another, quieter drama was unfolding within the precinct itself, centered around the increasingly troubled conscience of Officer David Ramirez. He couldn't shake the image of Isaiah battered and bleeding in the rain. He couldn't erase the sound of Miller's cruel laughter, or the memory of his own suffocating silence. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes, David, the hardest thing in the world is to do the right thing when everyone around you is doing wrong. The small act of kindness, the coffee and sandwich he'd given Isaiah, had been a fleeting moment of personal integrity, but it did little to assuage the guilt that gnawed at him. He saw the casual brutality continue, perhaps even escalate, as Miller and Kowalski grew bolder, more arrogant, seemingly untouchable. Ramirez tried to make himself scarce during their more egregious abuses, finding reasons to be elsewhere, to answer another call, but he couldn't always avoid it. And every time he witnessed an act of injustice and did nothing, a little piece of his own self-respect chipped away. It was Agent Riley and Colonel Hayes who finally brought Ramirez to his breaking point, his personal crossroads. They approached him discreetly, away from the prying eyes of the precinct. No strong-arm tactics, no overt threats, just a calm, professional presentation of facts. They didn't reveal the full scope of their operation, nor did they mention Isaiah's involvement or General Thorne. They simply laid out some of the evidence they had already gathered, anonymized financial records hinting at unexplained income for Miller and Donovan, snippets of surveillance audio, carefully scrubbed of anything that would compromise their methods, of questionable dealings. Officer Ramirez, Agent Riley began, his voice even, his gaze steady. We're conducting an investigation into certain irregularities within the Aurora Police Department. We have reason to believe that some officers may be involved in activities that compromise their oath and the public trust. Colonel Hayes, equally composed, added, We also have information suggesting that you may have witnessed certain incidents, perhaps even felt uncomfortable with some of the conduct you've observed. Ramirez sat there, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment he had both dreaded and, in a strange way, hoped for. He could deny it, play dumb, protect himself and his fledgling career. Or he could tell the truth. He thought of his father's badge, now kept in a small, velvet-lined box on his mother's dresser. He thought of Isaiah's quiet dignity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. He thought of the disillusionment he felt every time he pinned on his own shield. "Uncomfortable?" Ramirez finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, you could say that, Colonel. What I've seen, it's not policing. It's thuggery. It's a betrayal of everything this uniform is supposed to stand for." Riley and Hayes exchanged a subtle glance. This was the opening they needed. "We understand this is a difficult position for you, officer," Riley said, his tone softening slightly. "The blue wall of silence is a powerful thing. Loyalty to your fellow officers is deeply ingrained. But there's a higher loyalty, isn't there? Loyalty to the badge itself, to the law, to the people you swore to protect." "What do you want from me?" Ramirez asked, looking from Riley to Hayes, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a dawning resolve. "We want the truth, Officer Ramirez," Hayes stated simply. "We believe you are a good cop, caught in a bad situation. We're offering you a chance to help us clean house, to make things right." They didn't pressure him for an immediate decision. They gave him a secure, untraceable number to call if he chose to cooperate, and they left him with a stark choice: remain silent and become, by default, complicit in the corruption, or step forward and risk the consequences, but retain his integrity. The next few days were an agony for David Ramirez. He replayed the conversation with Riley and Hayes over and over in his mind. He imagined the fallout if he cooperated, the ostracism from his colleagues, the whispers, the potential threats. Miller and Kowalski were not men to be crossed lightly. And Captain Donovan? He had connections, power. Ramirez could lose his job, his career, everything he'd worked for. But then he'd see Isaiah's face in his mind's eye. He'd hear his mother's voice. He'd feel that sickening knot of shame in his stomach every time Miller barked an order or Kowalski cracked a vile joke at some poor soulless expense. The tipping point came during a late-night shift. Captain Donovan called Miller into his office. Ramirez, by chance, was at the desk just outside, finishing up some paperwork. The door to Donovan's office was slightly ajar. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help but overhear snippets of the hushed, angry conversation. "Getting sloppy, Miller. Too much heat lately." Donovan's voice was low, menacing. "Peterson is breathing down my neck about that Adams Street property. Need it cleared, and quietly. That old black bastard, the one you boys like to play with. Make sure he understands he's not welcome around there anymore. Permanently, if necessary. Permanently." The word chilled Ramirez to the bone. They weren't just harassing Isaiah. They were actively plotting to ensure he was gone, possibly for good. All for some dirty real estate deal orchestrated by Councilman Peterson. That was it. The Giat Nuak John Tran Lai, as his mother would say. The last drop that made the cup overflow. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. But now it was overshadowed by a fierce, righteous anger. He couldn't be a part of this. He wouldn't. The next morning, David Ramirez picked up his burner phone, the one he'd bought with cash after meeting Riley and Hayes, and dialed the number they had given him. "Special Agent Riley," he said, his voice clear and steady, all trace of hesitation gone. "This is Officer Ramirez. I'm ready to talk. And I have something you need to hear." What he had was far more valuable than just his testimony. In the days following his conversation with Donovan and Miller, Ramirez, driven by his newfound resolve and a considerable amount of fear-induced adrenaline, had taken a monumental risk. He had managed to covertly record a subsequent damning conversation in Captain Donovan's office. Using a tiny, almost undetectable recording device he'd purchased online, he'd captured Donovan explicitly discussing kickbacks from Sal Moretti and giving Miller instructions on how to persuade uncooperative witnesses in an ongoing internal affairs probe into a minor complaint. A probe Donovan was supposed to be overseeing impartially. The audio quality wasn't perfect, But Donovan's voice and the incriminating nature of his words were undeniable. "Officer Ramirez," Agent Riley said after listening to the recording, a rare note of admiration in his voice. "You just might have handed us the keys to the kingdom. You did good, son. You did damn good." David Ramirez didn't feel like a hero. He felt terrified. But as he walked out of the secret meeting location with Riley and Hayes, he also felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a lightness, a sense of rightness. He had chosen his side. He had chosen to stand for something, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant facing the storm that was inevitably coming. The rookie cop, the one who had been lost and disillusioned, had finally found his courage. The blue wall of silence had just sprung a very significant leak. The noose, woven from threads of federal investigation and Ramirez's damning recordings, was tightening around Miller, Kowalski, and Captain Donovan. They didn't know the full extent of it, not yet, but they could feel the temperature changing. The air in the precinct grew thick with unspoken anxieties. Whispers followed them down hallways. Internal affairs, previously a toothless tiger, suddenly seemed to be showing a little more bite in unrelated minor inquiries, likely a smokescreen orchestrated by Thorne's people to keep the real targets off balance. Miller, in particular, started to unravel. His usual bluster was edged with a new nervous aggression. He snapped at dispatchers, bullied rookies even more than usual, and his consumption of late-night whiskey at the cop bar, the Blue Line, increased noticeably. He felt like he was being watched, a paranoid sensation that for once was entirely accurate. "Something ain't right, Kowalski," he grumbled one evening, hunched over a beer, his eyes darting around the dimly lit bar. "It's too quiet. And that new kid Ramirez, he's been acting squirrely, you notice?" Kowalski, ever the follower, nodded nervously. "Yeah, boss. He barely says 2 words to us anymore. Keeps to himself. Maybe he's just a weirdo." "Or maybe he's a rat," Miller hissed, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like rats, Kowalski. Rats get stepped on." Captain Donovan, too, was feeling the pressure. Councilman Peterson had been calling more frequently, his voice tight with impatience, demanding updates on the clearance of the Adams Street properties. "Frank, this needs to happen yesterday," Peterson had barked over the phone. "My investors are getting antsy. That old black squatter, the one Miller has a hard-on for, he's still there. He needs to be encouraged to relocate. Permanently." Donovan knew permanently was code, a deniable instruction for Miller to ensure Isaiah Washington disappeared, one way or another. Normally, Donovan would have relished giving such an order, a demonstration of his control. But now, with this vague, uneasy feeling that things were shifting beneath his feet, he hesitated. He tried to put Peterson off, citing procedural delays, but the councilman wasn't buying it. The heat was on, from above and, unbeknownst to him, from far, far above. It was Miller who finally snapped. Driven by a potent cocktail of paranoia, alcohol, and a desperate desire to reassert his dominance, he decided he needed to make an example. He needed to eliminate the perceived source of his problems, the man who, in his twisted mind, had somehow brought this unwanted scrutiny upon them. Isaiah Washington. "Tonight, Kowalski," Miller declared, his voice low and gravelly after a particularly tense conversation with Donovan. "We're going to pay our old friend Ice a final visit. We're going to make sure he understands once and for all that Aurora ain't his town anymore, and that some ghosts need to stay ghosts." Kowalski, though visibly uneasy, didn't dare question Miller in this mood. He just nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Whatever you say, boss." The task force, thanks to Ramirez's continued, albeit terrified, flow of information and their own sophisticated surveillance, picked up on Miller's agitated state and his increasingly reckless talk. Agent Riley and Colonel Hayes knew they were entering a critical phase. Miller was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are unpredictable and dangerous. They had to protect Isaiah, their star witness, the man who had inadvertently blown the lid off this whole rotten enterprise. But they also saw an opportunity. If Miller made a move on Isaiah, it would be the final irrefutable nail in his coffin. "He's going to do something stupid, John," Colonel Hayes said to Riley, reviewing the latest intelligence. "He's cracking. We need to be ready." "We will be, Evelyn," Riley assured her. "Our people are on Isaiah 24/7, discreetly, of course, and we've got ears everywhere Miller and Kowalski go. If they so much as breathe in Isaiah's direction, we'll know." Isaiah, now in a slightly more comfortable, though still hidden safe house arranged by the task force, was also aware that the endgame was approaching. He could feel it in the increased tension in Hayes's voice during their debriefs, in the way Riley's eyes seemed to bore into him, searching for any sign of weakness. He was no stranger to danger, to the nerve-wracking calm before the storm. He'd lived it, breathed it, for years. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was his country, his city, and the enemy wore a familiar uniform. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. The beatings, the degradation, had burned away the last vestiges of fear, leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. He had started this, unintentionally, by simply existing, by refusing to be completely broken, and he would see it through. "They'll come for me, won't they?" Isaiah stated it more as a fact than a question during one of his meetings with Hayes. Hayes met his gaze directly. "It's a strong possibility, Sergeant. Miller is unstable. He sees you as the problem." "Good," Isaiah said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Let him come. Some vermin are best dealt with when they crawl out of their holes." Colonel Hayes almost smiled back. This wasn't a victim they were protecting. This was a warrior, temporarily sidelined perhaps, but a warrior nonetheless. And the shadows of Aurora were about to witness that warrior awaken. The final act of this desperate drama was about to begin, and the stage was being set for a confrontation that would either bring justice or unleash further tragedy. Miller and Kowalski, blinded by their arrogance and fear, were walking into a trap, but they were also bringing the full force of their depravity with them. The beast was wounded, enraged, and on the hunt. The chosen stage for Miller's final, desperate act was, ironically, the very same grimy, rain-slicked alleyway where he and Kowalski had first awakened the sleeping giant within Isaiah Washington. Miller, in his alcohol-fueled paranoia, believed Isaiah would have crawled back to one of his old haunts, a creature of habit seeking familiar misery. He didn't know that Isaiah was no longer there, no longer a creature of anything but calculated patience. He didn't know that the alley tonight was not a hunting ground for him, but a meticulously prepared kill box. Colonel Hayes and Agent Riley had anticipated Miller's move. Their surveillance had picked up on Miller's increasingly agitated phone calls, his drunken boast at the Blue Line about settling accounts. They knew he was fixated on Isaiah. So, with Isaiah's reluctant but understanding agreement, he'd much preferred to be the bait himself, but Thorne had put his foot down on that. They'd set the trap. A decoy, one of their more seasoned undercover operatives, a black man of similar build and age to Isaiah, bundled in tattered clothes, was positioned in the alcove where Isaiah had often sought shelter. Hidden cameras, equipped with night vision, covered every angle. Tactical teams, a mix of FBI SWAT and military police Thorne had discreetly borrowed, were concealed in nearby buildings, in unmarked vans, ready to move in on Riley's signal. Officer David Ramirez, a crucial witness and now a vital asset, was also nearby, in a separate, secure vehicle with a handler, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He'd provided the final confirmation of Miller's intentions, having overheard Miller telling Kowalski, "Tonight, we finish what we started with that old bastard. No witnesses, no loose ends." Miller and Kowalski rolled up in Miller's souped-up off-duty pickup truck, its engine rumbling like a caged beast. They were both out of uniform, dressed in dark civilian clothes, trying for an anonymity that only made them look more menacing. Miller was visibly intoxicated, his movements jerky, his face flushed. Kowalski, by contrast, was pale and sweating, his eyes darting nervously around the deserted alley. "You sure about this, boss?" Kowalski whispered, his voice cracking. "This feels wrong. We're cops, not this." "Shut up, Kowalski," Miller snarled, grabbing a heavy tire iron from the truck bed. "We are the law here, and I say this scum needs to be taught a permanent lesson. He's the reason everything's going to shit. Now are you with me, or are you a coward?" Kowalski, trapped between his fear of Miller and his even greater fear of what they were about to do, reluctantly nodded, his hand straying towards the bulge of an unauthorized pistol tucked into his waistband. They advanced down the alley, Miller in the lead, swinging the tire iron idly, like a grotesque parody of a medieval knight with a mace. The decoy operative, well-schooled in his role, feigned sleep, a low moan escaping his lips as they approached. "Wakey, wakey, old man," Miller growled, prodding the figure with the tire iron. "Got a special delivery for you." The decoy stirred, looking up with feigned terror. "Please. What do you want? I ain't done nothing." "Oh, you've done plenty, you piece of filth," Miller spat, raising the tire iron. "You've stuck your nose where it don't belong, and now you're gonna pay the price." It was at that precise moment, as Miller was about to bring the tire iron down, that the night exploded. Not with a gunshot, not yet, but with light. Blinding, disorienting floodlights from multiple directions, turning the dark alley into an overexposed stage. And with sound. Agent Riley's voice, amplified, booming, authoritative. "FBI, Miller, Kowalski, don't move. Put your hands in the air, now." Miller froze, the tire iron halfway raised, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. Kowalski yelped, dropping his own weapon, a cheap, unregistered .38 he'd been carrying, and immediately thrusting his hands skyward, babbling, don't shoot, it wasn't me, it was him, he made me." From the shadows, from doorways, from the rooftops, figures emerged. Dark-clad, heavily armed, moving with a silent, professional efficiency that spoke of years of training. The alley was suddenly swarming with federal agents and military police. Miller, however, was not going down without a fight, or at least a futile, desperate gesture of defiance. With a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, he spun, not towards the armed agents, but back towards the decoy, perhaps in a last insane attempt to carry out his twisted plan. "You bastard!" he screamed, lunging. But he never reached his target. From a darkened doorway, a figure moved with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. It was Isaiah Washington, not the decoy, the real Isaiah. Thorne had bent the rules slightly, allowing Isaiah, under heavy, albeit unseen protection, to be present, to witness this. Isaiah had insisted. He needed to see this through, to confront his tormentor, not as a victim, but as an equal, if not more. Isaiah didn't have a weapon, not a conventional one. He didn't need it. As Miller lunged, Isaiah sidestepped with the grace of a matador, his hand shooting out not in a punch, but in an open palm strike to Miller's exposed wrist, the one holding the tire iron. There was a sickening crack. The tire iron clattered to the wet pavement. Miller screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony and surprise clutching his shattered wrist. Before Miller could even process what had happened, Isaiah moved again. A swift, disabling leg sweep. Miller, his balance already compromised, his mind reeling, went down hard, his head hitting the concrete with a dull thud. He lay there dazed, moaning, the fight completely knocked out of him. The fight. Isaiah stood over him, not with triumph, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary sadness. "It's over, Miller," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly in the suddenly still alley. It was always going to be over. Agent Riley and Colonel Hayes were the first to reach them. Riley cuffed a whimpering, blubbering Kowalski, while Hayes, with 2 MPs, secured the groaning, incapacitated Miller. "Sergeant Washington," Riley said, giving Isaiah a nod of profound respect. "I believe you just saved our decoy a world of hurt, and probably saved Miller from a far worse fate at the hands of my trigger-happy SWAT guys." Isaiah just looked down at Miller, then at the surrounding agents. "He needed to be stopped," he said simply. "They all do." In the back of an unmarked car, David Ramirez watched the scene unfold, a strange mixture of relief and residual fear washing over him. He saw Miller, the precinct bully, the untouchable tyrant, now a broken, pathetic figure. He saw Kowalski, sobbing like a child. And he saw Isaiah Washington standing tall, a quiet figure of immense strength and dignity, the man who had endured so much, now finally, undeniably, the victor. The trap had been sprung. The predators had become the prey. The long, dark night in Aurora was finally giving way to a very harsh, very revealing dawn. Captain Donovan and Councilman Peterson, a few miles away, snug in their beds, had no idea that their world was about to come crashing down around them too. The dominoes, set in motion by one forgotten man in a dark alley, were now falling fast and hard. The arrests of Officers Miller and Kowalski, along with the subsequent, almost simultaneous apprehensions of Captain Frank Donovan at his suburban home, and City Councilman Arthur Peterson as he was attempting a pre-dawn emergency trip out of town, sent shockwaves through Aurora and beyond. The carefully constructed facade of law and order in certain echelons of the city had been shattered, and the pieces were now being meticulously collected by federal hands. The weeks that followed were a blur of intense legal activity. Kowalski, faced with a mountain of evidence and the chilling prospect of decades in federal prison, crumbled almost immediately. He sang as Agent Riley had predicted, like a particularly terrified canary, implicating Miller as the instigator of the violence, Donovan as the corrupt overseer, and even providing details about Councilman Peterson's real estate schemes and the pressure he exerted on the police department to sanitize targeted neighborhoods. His testimony, offered in exchange for a plea deal and a significantly reduced sentence, became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Officer David Ramirez, though not facing criminal charges himself due to his cooperation, also provided crucial testimony. He detailed the culture of intimidation within the precinct, the casual abuses he had witnessed, and corroborated key aspects of Kowalski's account. His internal recordings of Captain Donovan were a bombshell, irrefutable proof of the captain's direct involvement in bribery and obstruction of justice. For Ramirez, testifying against his former colleagues was an ordeal, but every word he spoke felt like a weight lifting from his soul. He was, finally, the officer his father would have been proud of. General Marcus Thorne, true to his word, did not remain in the shadows. Once the initial arrests were made and the federal investigation was officially announced, he stepped forward, a four-star general lending his immense credibility and moral authority to the unfolding drama. In a press conference that was broadcast nationally, Thorne, flanked by Agent Riley and a grim-faced U.S. attorney, spoke not just of corruption, but of a betrayal of public trust, and specifically, the shameful mistreatment of a decorated veteran, Sergeant Isaiah "Ice" Washington. Sergeant Washington served this nation with extraordinary courage and distinction, Thorne stated, his voice resonating with controlled anger. To think that he, or any veteran, or indeed any citizen, could be subjected to such abuse at the hands of those sworn to protect them, is an outrage that demands a full and uncompromising response. This is not just about Aurora. This is about the soul of our communities. The media frenzy was immediate and intense. The story of the homeless hero, the forgotten Green Beret who had single-handedly, or so the popular narrative began to frame it, brought down a corrupt police ring, captivated the nation. Isaiah's carefully guarded anonymity was shattered. His face, a younger, uniformed version from an old service photo unearthed by the press, was suddenly everywhere. The trial of Miller, Donovan, and Peterson was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of Aurora's shaken community. Isaiah Washington, dressed in a simple, clean suit provided by the military, a stark contrast to the tattered clothes he had worn for so long, was the prosecution's star witness. When he took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. He spoke calmly, his voice low but clear, detailing the relentless harassment, the beatings, the taunts. He recounted his observations of their corrupt dealings, his descriptions precise, his memory unwavering. He didn't embellish, didn't resort to theatrics. He simply told his truth, the unvarnished, brutal truth of life on the streets at the mercy of men like Miller. Miller's defense attorney, a high-priced shark known for his aggressive tactics, tried to discredit Isaiah, to paint him as an unreliable, mentally unstable vagrant with a vendetta. "Mr. Washington," the attorney sneered, "isn't it true that you have a history of, shall we say, erratic behavior? That you've been living on the streets for years, by choice?" Isaiah met the lawyer's gaze, his own unwavering. "Sir," he replied, his voice still quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "I lived on the streets because I fell through the cracks of a system that sometimes forgets its own. As for erratic behavior, I believe the evidence will show who truly behaved erratically and criminally." The lawyer pressed, trying to poke holes in Isaiah's account of the beatings. "You're a trained Special Forces soldier, Mr. Washington, a Green Beret. Are you telling this court that 2 patrolmen could repeatedly overpower you?" "Counselor," Isaiah responded, a hint of weariness in his tone, "there's a difference between being able to fight and choosing to fight. When you're homeless, when you have nothing, attracting attention, especially from the police, is often the last thing you want to do. Sometimes survival means enduring, observing, waiting for the right moment. My training taught me many things, including when not to engage." His testimony was devastating. His quiet dignity, his refusal to be baited, his articulate and precise recall of events, resonated powerfully with the jury and the public. He wasn't just a victim. He was a survivor, a man of incredible resilience and integrity. Councilman Peterson's defense was one of ignorance. He claimed he had no idea about the strong-arm tactics being used, that he was merely a victim of ambitious underlings. Captain Donovan tried to shift all blame to Miller and Kowalski, painting himself as a busy, overwhelmed commander who couldn't possibly know everything his officers were doing. Miller, defiant to the end, maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed, a scapegoat for a system that was out to get him. But the evidence meticulously presented by the U.S. Attorney's Office, the financial records, Kowalski's testimony, Ramirez's recordings, the surveillance footage, and above all, Isaiah's powerful, unshakable account, was overwhelming. The blue wall of silence had not just been breached, it had been demolished. The truth, ugly and raw, was laid bare for all to see. The velvet curtain of legal proceedings was pulled back, revealing the rot beneath. And Isaiah Washington, the ghost from the alley, stood at the center of it all, a quiet testament to the enduring power of one man's refusal to be erased. The jury, it was clear, was listening intently. The fate of Miller, Donovan, and Peterson now rested in their hands. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. For Aurora, for Isaiah, for everyone touched by the sprawling tendrils of this case, it felt like an eternity. Then, the call came. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, an electric tension crackling in the air as the jury forewoman, a middle-aged schoolteacher with a solemn expression, handed the verdict forms to the bailiff. Michael Miller. Guilty. On all counts. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy, extortion, assault. His face, which had maintained a defiant smirk throughout much of the trial, finally crumbled, sagging into a mask of disbelief, and then dawning, ugly rage. He started to rise, to shout, but his attorney quickly placed a restraining hand on his arm. Captain Frank Donovan. Guilty. Conspiracy. Bribery. Obstruction of justice. He visibly deflated, his carefully constructed image of a tough, in-control police commander dissolving into that of a scared, beaten old man. He slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. City Councilman Arthur Peterson. Guilty. Conspiracy. Wire fraud. Honest services fraud. His political career. His carefully cultivated reputation as a civic leader. All gone. Incinerated in the harsh glare of federal justice. He simply stared blankly ahead, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Kowalski, who had already pleaded guilty and testified, watched from the gallery under guard, his expression a mixture of fear and a strange, almost pathetic relief. The sentences, handed down a few weeks later by a no-nonsense federal judge, were severe. Miller received 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 25. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called Miller's actions a monstrous betrayal of the badge and a stain upon the honor of every decent law enforcement officer. Donovan got 15 years, his age and feigned ill health doing little to sway the court. Peterson, despite his attempts to play the victim, was handed a 12-year sentence and ordered to pay substantial restitution for his fraudulent real estate schemes. Kowalski received 5 years, a significantly lighter sentence due to his cooperation, but still a stark reminder that even following illegal orders carries a heavy price. The gavel fell. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. The sound echoed not just in the courtroom but throughout Aurora. It was a sound of closure for some, a sound of vindication for others, and for the city as a whole, a sound that signaled the beginning of a long, painful, but necessary reckoning. The reverberations of the Aurora PD scandal were immediate and far-reaching. The city council, in a state of shock and desperate to regain public trust, launched a massive independent review of the police department. Dozens of other officers implicated by Kowalski's testimony, or by the ensuing internal investigations, were suspended, fired, or chose to quietly resign rather than face scrutiny. The Blue Line Bar, once a raucous haven for Miller and his cronies, became a quiet, somber place, its patrons now acutely aware that the old ways were over. Across the nation, the case became a touchstone, a stark example of systemic corruption and the vulnerability of marginalized communities. It fueled ongoing debates about police accountability, racial bias in law enforcement, and the often invisible plight of homeless veterans. Suddenly, people were talking about Aurora, Illinois, not as just another Midwestern city, but as a place where one man's quiet courage had exposed a deep-seated rot. For Isaiah Washington, the verdicts brought a sense of grim satisfaction, but not elation. There was no joy in seeing men imprisoned, even these men. There was only a weary acknowledgement that a necessary, painful chapter had closed. He had wanted justice, not revenge. And justice, in its imperfect human way, had been delivered. The media attention, however, did not subside. If anything, it intensified. Isaiah, the homeless hero, the Green Beret ghost, was besieged with interview requests, book deals, movie offers. He politely, firmly declined them all. He had not sought the spotlight, and he had no desire to remain in it. "My story is told," he would say quietly to those who managed to reach him through General Thorne's protective cordon. Now it's time for the healing to begin. And the healing in Aurora did begin, albeit slowly and tentatively. Donations poured into local shelters and veterans organizations. Volunteers inspired by Isaiah's story showed up in droves, offering time, resources, and a compassionate ear. The city, shamed into action, allocated emergency funding to expand services for the homeless, particularly for veterans. New programs were established, focusing not just on providing a meal and a bed, but on addressing the underlying issues of PTSD, addiction, and lack of job opportunities that so often led to life on the streets. One of the first tangible results was the renovation of a dilapidated city-owned building into a new state-of-the-art transitional housing facility for homeless veterans. It was named, quite simply, Washington House. Isaiah had initially protested the use of his name, but General Thorne had been insistent. "It's not about you, Ice," Thorne had said. "It's about what you represent. Hope, resilience, the fact that no one should be forgotten." The plaque by the entrance read, "Washington House, in honor of Sergeant Isaiah Ice Washington and all those who have served, who have fallen through the cracks, and who deserve a pathway home. Here, you are not forgotten." Isaiah, though he shied away from public appearances, became a quiet, guiding presence behind the scenes. He would visit Washington House not as a celebrity, but as a peer, talking to the residents, listening to their stories, offering a quiet word of encouragement. He understood their struggles in a way that no well-meaning social worker ever could. He had walked in their shoes, slept on their concrete beds, felt their gnawing hunger and their crushing invisibility. Officer David Ramirez, now hailed as a hero in his own right for his bravery in coming forward, was also part of this new beginning. He'd been offered a detective shield, a fast track up the ladder, but he'd surprised everyone by requesting a transfer to the newly formed Community Outreach Unit. His mission, to rebuild trust between the Aurora PD and the very communities that Miller and Donovan had terrorized. It was a daunting task, but Ramirez embraced it with a quiet determination. He knew firsthand the damage that had been done, and he was committed to being part of the solution. The seeds of change, sown in the dark soil of corruption and injustice, were beginning to sprout. It was a fragile growth, easily trampled, but it was there. And it had all started with the quiet defiance of one man, a man the world had tried to erase, but who had refused to disappear. The echoes of that gavel were not just the end of an old rotten story. They were the tentative, hopeful first notes of a new one. Aurora was listening, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, it was ready to truly see the people it had for too long ignored. The whirlwind of the trial and its immediate aftermath eventually began to settle, like dust after a storm. For Isaiah Washington, life took on a new, unexpected rhythm. General Thorne, ever loyal, had not forgotten his promise to ensure Isaiah was taken care of. He didn't just offer protection, he offered a path back, a tangible recognition of Isaiah's service and sacrifice. One crisp autumn afternoon, in a quiet, sunlit office at a nearby military installation, Thorne slid a set of official-looking documents across the polished mahogany table towards Isaiah. So tonight, as you switch off this podcast, as you go about your lives in your own cities, your own towns, I want to leave you with a question, a challenge perhaps. Look around you. Really look. Beyond the surface, beyond the easy judgments. How many Isaiah Washingtons are walking your streets, their stories untold, their potential untapped, their quiet heroism unseen? And more importantly, what are we vowing as individuals, as communities, as a nation, prepared to do to ensure that no more heroes are forced to live in the shadows? What steps will we take to shine a light into those dark corners, to offer a hand up, to listen to the voices that have been silenced for too long? The story of Isaiah Ice Washington is a powerful one, but its true power lies not just in the telling but in what we choose to do with it. Let it be more than just a story. Let it be an inspiration. Let it be a catalyst. This has been Racist Stories. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Click that notification bell. Because believe me, there are more stories like Isaiah's out there, more truths waiting to be uncovered. And you won't want to miss a single one. Because the next person they try to erase could be you.